It's so great to be here. And I am delighted that we're having Rachel Cockerell as our guest. So I have been obsessed with Melting Point, a truly unique book where so many of my interests converge: Jewish history, family memoir, the search for home. I don't know whether to say it was written by Rachel or curated by her, but I can say this: it is a profoundly moving, creative work. The New Yorker called the book a dazzling debut, and it certainly is. The book is a story of refugees and diaspora, but truly like nothing I've ever read. It's also unexpectedly timely, since its focus for about the first third of the book is on the roots of Zionism. It's especially wonderful for Rachel to tell us about her book for the American Jewish Historical Society, because she demonstrates the magic that can lie in archives. And the story behind the story, how Rachel arrived at a new way of narrating history, is one I cannot wait to hear about. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's really my pleasure. As you can tell, Rachel is not from New York, even though she's here right now. But so glad to have you here to talk about your book.
Thank you so much.
So this is a work of nonfiction, but honestly, just from the very beginning, it sounds like an intriguing novel. So I'm just going to read the very opening. This is the opening of the book. A year ago, while I was drinking afternoon tea in a London drawing room, there entered a tall, lithe man with coal-black hair, beard, and mustaches, restless, visionary eyes, and a nervous mouth, twitching with half-sad humor. I did not know him, but he magnetized me immediately. That's the opening line, and it comes from actually an article in a British newspaper. So this man of mystery is none other than Theodore Herzl, known as the father of modern Zionism. And as you'll learn pretty quickly, he was a real handsome guy and very charismatic, which is not certainly how I guess I had imagined him. So tell us, Rachel, why you decided to start your family memoir with Theodore Herzl.
I think I really just wanted to write a normal family memoir, something quite sort of narrow and domestic, and just a story just about my family, and sort of a sort of isolated story. And then I realized that, as with every family, my family was sort of intertwined with the story of the 20th century and with these figures who've been remembered by the history books, even if my family hasn't. And also, I realized that my family's arrival in London from the Russian Empire, just as World War I broke out, could be traced all the way back and back and back and back to Theodore Herzl writing this little pamphlet called The Jewish State, with which he founded modern Zionism. You know, it seems strange to say that my British Jewish family got where it got because of Herzl and because of the founding of Zionism. But you know, there's this phrase in the book, the unresting chain of events. And I think, you know, I'm sure every person on this call has had this experience of tracing something so far back that the source seems sort of unrecognizable from all the things that it caused, and all those sort of butterfly effects.
Yeah, the butterfly effects. Did you know much about Herzl at all before you start, or had you even heard of Herzl at all before you started working on this book?
The name sort of rung a bell, and I don't know if anyone has seen pictures of Charles Darwin, but I kind of imagined that Herzl looked a bit like Darwin, had a long gray beard, a sort of a worried look on his face, maybe was an old man who I knew he had sort of founded something, but I really, as you can tell, I was like staring out of the window in most of my history classes. And I discovered that, Herzl was not this sort of solemn, somber, thinker of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was this young very much assimilated Jewish journalist living in Vienna, writing these sort of funny and whimsical newspaper columns, usually about an amusing thing one of his children did that day, and he saw that his own work, he felt that his own work was trivial, and he saw that perhaps founding a modern Jewish state in Palestine could be a way of making his mark in history. And if that failed, then maybe at least he could write a novel out of it. None of this I knew, and the more I read about Herzl, and as you can probably tell from that opening line, he was amazingly sort of charismatic and memorable. The more I realized that he was a sort of character in this story.
Right. And, I can tell you kind of got a little, I don't want to say a crush, but, you obviously, you're surprised about him come through a lot, because in those opening, the opening of the book, which is really introducing us to this figure who I think all of us thought of as the long, gray, serious beard man. But I think it might be useful now. I think a number of people I can see chatting have already read the book, but for those who don't, and I had read a lot about the book beforehand, but it's kind of hard to understand what it means. Oh, she writes it all from primary sources. And I do want to tell people that that may sound intimidating, but it really reads like a novel. And so, like, when did you realize what not so much even the form of the book, but when did you feel that jazzy moment when, like, hey, this guy is a great character? And how much of what you read about him could you not even include? Because I could see you wanted to write a lot about him.
Yeah, I mean, I was so surprised by how sort of fervently people wrote about him. All these male journalists writing about him, almost as if they had crushes on him. Would say, one man said that if he was walking down the street in Vienna and he met Herzl coming the opposite direction, he would just turn around and abandon his destination and walk with Herzl, because wherever Herzl was going was better. Jabotinsky said, Herzl made a colossal impression on me. There's no other word for it, colossal. I don't remember anyone who has made an impression on me before or since. He was just someone who you met for 8 seconds and then you thought about for the rest of your life. So, I mean, reading all these primary sources and I say primary sources, which it sounds kind of off-putting. It was really just people's memories of Herzl, maybe written a few days after they'd met him, or maybe a few decades after they'd met him, or maybe they had been friends with him for many years, made me see that perhaps sort of stitching all these accounts together, rather than me as someone in the 21st century who had never met Herzl, telling the reader about him, would be more powerful and more immediate, and as you say, maybe a bit more novelistic, and sort of take you there rather than have a sort of middleman. So that was partly in my mind when I decided to form the whole book of primary sources. I guess I should explain that all that means is that it's a normal nonfiction book, but without my voice in there. So, every nonfiction book is a sort of interweaving of primary sources, but usually they will have the glue of the author sort of either leading you from one to the next, or being a sort of character in it. And I wanted neither of those things. I wanted not to be a character in it, and I wanted the sources to lead one from the next, so they sort of flowed, and it was almost like these voices were sort of in conversation with each other despite being dead for 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so remarkable about it, because even though you say you don't have that narrative glue, it feels like you do. It's not like you're reading these disjointed things. One really flows into the other. But I wonder if when you started this book, you may not have expected to be quite as timely as it turned out to be in the discussion of Zionism. And one of the things that I found so fascinating about it, and that can lead us to a discussion of Israel Zangwill and the Galveston Project and all of that, is there are many debates now about what Zionism is and what Zionism isn't, but I think that's part of the history of Zionism, right? Even the main difference being as to where it is. So if you could talk a little bit about when that became such a big part of the story, and the surprising, at least surprising to me, of what you found out about all these different places that might have been the land of Zion. Maybe we'd have different wars now and different conversations, but or the same one, but a different place, right?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that I kept on coming back to, which one of my relatives just she just used this phrase in passing, and I've sort of thought about it ever since, was it's never inevitable at the time. She was born in 1930, and she remembers growing up in New York in the 30s and feeling this sort of specter of war, especially as it got to sort of 1938. Knowing, she was a very plugged in child, and knowing things were not right in Europe, and watching, going to the cinema and watching her favorite cartoons, and there would be a newsreel beforehand, and thinking as a 9-year-old child, who is this awful guy Hitler, across the ocean, and she and her friends would sort of sing songs about him, and draw him on the underside of their shoes so they could stamp on him. But yeah, she used this phrase, it's never inevitable at the time. And I think that kind of applies to the whole idea of my book, which is, viewing history without the benefit of hindsight, and without this sort of, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. So yeah, I guess I just, I really thought that was it was important for the reader to just be there without the context of what came next. And I guess with Zionism, and with the sort of, this book is, the subtitle is, the search for a promised land, and that search for a promised land was not inevitably going to be the promised land. It was not the promised land as we think of today as synonymous with Israel. Herzl himself wrote, in his pamphlet, The Jewish State, about other possibilities, some in South America, for example. And yeah, in the early 20th century, there were all these alternative promised lands, which almost sort of came to fruition. Obviously, most famously is the Uganda Plan. And journalists in 1903 were writing, it is likely that this time next year we will see the first pioneer party of Jews going to sort of settle in East Africa, and found a modern Jewish homeland there. And yeah, there was this huge search, which really occupied the first 10 years of the 20th century for some alternative Jewish refuge, while the gates of Palestine remained closed, as Israel Zangwill said.
Yeah, and to tell people a little bit about Israel Zangwill, because even though he was incredibly famous in real time, in hindsight time, I think very few people know who he is. I did not until I read your book.
Yeah, so Israel Zangwill, again, I had this plan to write a normal family memoir, and Israel Zangwill is no relative of mine. He was a close friend of my great-grandfather's, but he's not related to me. And yet he sort of insisted on pretty much taking over this book, which was meant to be about me and my family. Zangwill was once the most famous Jewish writer in the English-speaking world. There's an amazing book about him, by Mary Jane Rochelson, which was a sort of huge form of inspiration for me. And he wrote novels. He wrote a novel called The Children of the Ghetto, which was beloved across England and America. And really his only legacy is this play that he wrote in 1908 called The Melting Pot. Quite a bad play about two immigrants who fall in love and decide to melt into the melting pot of New York. But no one really performs the play anymore, but that title has lived on. It sort of sparked this nationwide discussion about the idea of the American melting pot, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for immigrants to sort of lose their old world ways and melt into the melting pot and emerge as shiny new Americans. I guess this is something that every American Jew thinks about. Are you less Jewish than your grandparents? Is there something that's slowly sort of dissolving away down the generations, or do you try and cling on to it? or is it possible to cling on to it? You know, these are all the questions that Zangwill was thinking about, and that that I was thinking about while I was writing my book. And, you know, everyone, my book is called Melting Point, but everyone calls it Melting Pot. And I kind of, at first I thought like, oh, come on, you know, that's not the title, but now I kind of like it. It's almost this sort of title. But yeah, Zangwill just, like Herzl, sort of captivated me. He was, this British writer, fairly shambolic, the worst dressed man in London, according to one journalist, the ugliest man in the world, according to another journalist, and yet sort of, people adored him for his wit and for his clever writing.
So we're going to talk about the Galveston project in a minute, because that's, I guess, the American part of the history part of this. But as you say, this is a work of history, but it's also a family memoir. And somebody here had given a question, which you can fold into your answer, about why there wasn't more about what your great-great-grandfather did in the Ukraine for work, or I don't know who he was. But, you know, your name is Rachel Cockerell, so it's not a common Jewish name, I would say. And you come from two different strands. And so what, I guess, if you could, just when you started on this journey, could you sort of describe about a description of who you were when you began this professionally, but also personally, and the personal part being about your connection to being Jewish? How did you identify yourself? I mean, not so much, oh yeah, I'm part Jewish, but, and then what led you to do this? Because obviously you spent a long time thinking about that part of your heritage.
Yeah. So growing up, I vaguely knew that I was a bit Jewish. You know, I say a quarter Jewish, but you know, it's my dad's mum, so it's not so simple. And you know, my grandmother was called Fanny Jochelmann, and she married a nice Englishman called Hugh Cockerell, and maybe that was sort of the beginning of the end. You know, she had these children whose surname was Cockerell. She gave them nice English names. She didn't teach them Russian, which was her mother tongue. She didn't really cook any Jewish food. She just cooked really disgusting English food. This was 1940s North London, so you know, it was there was still rationing, and you know, she would just cook sort of white food, boiled potatoes and very overcooked fish and boiled cauliflower, all encased in white sauce. So yes, I think, you know, that one of my family members said that she tried to become more English than the English. And as a result, my dad is pretty English, you know, and as a result, I'm pretty English. So I kind of melted into the melting pot that Zangwill had been talking about all that time. And I guess writing this book made me see everything that has been lost just in the course of 3 generations in my family. All that sort of history and, you know, the heirlooms of Jewish life just sort of fell away. I'm so much less of a Russian Jew than my grandmother was, or than my great-grandfather was. So yeah, it was the Judaism was always peripheral for me, and it was only when I started this book, kind of, I don't know why I started it. There was just a bit of a sort of seed of interest there, and I thought, I wonder if there's a story here. Yeah, when I started this, I didn't feel particularly Jewish, and I don't know if I can say necessarily that I am more Jewish now than I was then, but I guess I have more of an understanding of how my family ended up being the way they are.
Wow, yeah. And so tell us how your family story connected to Herzl.
Yeah.
And to Zangwill, because it wasn't just some casual living at the same time, not even in the same place, but they had a very direct overlap. So if you could tell us a little bit about your great-grandfather.
Yeah. So my great-grandfather was the sort of vice president of the Galveston Project, or the Galveston Movement, which brought 10,000 Russian Jews to Texas in the years leading up to World War One. And the Galveston Project was really an offshoot of Zionism. So when in the early years of the 20th century, my great-grandfather and Zangwill were sort of at the Zionist congresses, voting, and they were both pro the Uganda plan. And when that fell through, a group of Zionists abandoned the movement in quite a dramatic way. They walked out of the Zionist Congress, and all the newspaper headlines at the time were Zionism splits. And this sort of rival group formed with the terrible name of the Jewish Territorial Organization. And they had this this sort of motto, really: if we cannot get the Holy Land, we can make another land holy. So Zangwill and my great-grandfather, having been sort of disciples of Herzl, just sort of rebelled from Zionism in the most dramatic way they could. The idea at the heart of Zionism, of modern Zionism, of a Jewish state in Palestine, they said, let's think of something else. And so they searched the world for some alternative Holy Land, or some alternative, at least, sort of stopping point, a temporary Jewish refuge. And all these plans in Australia and Canada and Mexico and Paraguay and many other places sort of almost happened, and then at the last minute fell through for one reason or another. And then their sort of last resort really was Galveston, Texas. They had been in touch with some American Jews, and they've made a plan to for Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire arriving in America to bypass New York completely and head down to the Gulf Coast, where they could become immigrants through Texas.
Wow. So there are two questions from people that are interesting, and I hope our audience appreciates the crazy complexity of this whole, not just writing the book, but actually creating the history that led to the writing of the book. So the two questions, which I think are somewhat connected, one is from somebody who says, I loved all caps, the book. That's a nice use of all caps. And she says, what came first, your great-grandfather's thoughts and work, or the U.S. industrial removal project? That was one point in the book that confused me. So if you could explain even what that is. And then somebody else asks, was there a connection between the Galveston Project and Mordechai Emanuel Moses' attempt to establish a Jewish state on an island in the Niagara River in the early 19th century?
Wow. Well, I that answer is easy. I have never heard of this, and I guess it predates the Galveston movement by a century. But maybe that'll be melting point too. I'll look into that. That sounds the other question, so the Industrial Removal Office is like a weird little subplot in my book. It was the sort of precursor to the Galveston movement, and I think it was around 1902, 1903, 1904, and it was this project to reduce the overcrowding of Russian Jews on the Lower East Side of New York. And the way these sort of German Jewish philanthropists thought of doing that was to literally remove the immigrants. Any immigrant who was struggling to find a job or to earn a living on the Lower East Side could sort of show up at the office of the Industrial Removal Office and say, can you remove me? And then they would be removed to somewhere in the American hinterland, as they called it. So they would literally sort of get on a sort of horse-drawn cart with their little bag and maybe some food for the journey, and be taken for a new life somewhere else that was not New York. And the idea was that any Jew who was struggling in New York would go elsewhere. But really, the numbers were tiny, and but yeah, it's just this strange little precursor to the Galveston movement, and strange little sort of little subplot in the story of American Jewish immigration. I believe that Golda Meir was I think her father was one of the sort of removals.
Oh, yeah, I think that's to Minnesota or someplace. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Here's somebody who definitely needs to read your book, but she was asked, wasn't the Galveston project financed by the New York German Jewish immigrant successful banker Jacob Schiff? So yeah, tell us a little bit about Jacob Schiff and how he got involved in this puzzle.
Yes, he is also a sort of character in the book. I was never quite sure what to make of Jacob Schiff. People said that he he had this very kindly demeanor, and he was very something very sort of noble about him almost, but underneath was this sort of steeliness. So Jacob Schiff is sort of this ambiguous character in my book. He finances the Industrial Removal Office, and he also finances the Galveston project. He approaches Zangwill and says, I hear that you're trying to find an alternative Jewish homeland. My project is to reduce the overcrowding of Jews in New York. Maybe we could find some common ground. Maybe we could work together to get Jewish immigrant, or Jews out of the Russian Empire and to America, but just not to New York. Schiff was a New Yorker, and I think there was a little bit of some sort of bad feeling towards these sort of slightly ragged Russian, newer Russian Jews who were arriving in New York, not learning English, speaking Yiddish and eating their strange smelling foods and not melting into the melting pot. And Schiff was very pro the melting pot and thought that Russian Jews should become American Jews and should take on all the sort of values of American life. And if they didn't, then anti-Semitism would become a menace across America. This we must not risk, he said. So he just wanted Russian Jews, or at least the sort of surplus of Russian Jews, to not be in New York. And he was sort of looking at different ways of doing that.
Yeah, no, I think that came across very clearly in your book. It's sort of a class thing, and the German Jews versus the Eastern Europeans. So I do want you to come back if you know what your great-great-grandfather did in Ukraine that produced your great-grandfather, David. But also somebody gives a little piece of correction. It was not Minnesota, it was Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Golda Meir, that was my mistake. Well, it was close. I think they're next to each other. But somebody also writes, so put a pin on the thing about your great-great-grandfather. But somebody else writes in, as a historian, I was fascinated by the way you constructed your narrative using only primary sources. As someone not deeply familiar with the scholarship on the history of Zionism, how common are the sources you used? Were they used regularly in more conventional scholarly works? I really liked your book a great deal, says this person.
What a lovely question. I tried to use as wildly different an array of sources as I possibly could. So that every page you're getting something from the New York Times or some sort of mainstream American newspaper, and then something from some memoir that someone wrote and has been out of print for the last 80 years. I used this amazing website called archive.org, which I'm sure some of the people here are familiar with, which is a digitized sort of library of, I think, millions of books, and you can search by keyword, which meant that I could find a certain mention of Zangwill or Herzl or my great-grandfather or Galveston in a book that would have taken years and years for me to find otherwise. So I used a lot of people's memoirs. I used newspapers. I used the Library of Congress's online newspaper archive called Chronicling America, which was an amazing help. There was another archive called Fulton History, which is like this slightly janky, sort of seemingly amateurish database of scanned newspapers, mainly from New York State, but just the most incredible collection and all scanned beautifully. So I really recommend that. I write about all the sort of archival sources I used in the afterword of the book. So yeah, it was newspapers, memoirs, some letters and some diaries, and also I did some recorded interviews. But I loved finding some super obscure sources. But then I loved when the New York Times said about Zangwill's play, the melting pot is cheap and tawdry, as the headline, or Zionism splits, Zangwill forms new rival group, or Russian Jews for Texas. The idea that this history, which has been sort of pruned away from the story of the 20th century, was actually in the headlines and was something that people were talking about at the time.
So, getting a lot of input from the audience, which I will come back to in a minute. It's great. You have a lot of people who have already read the book, want to read the book. Somebody's book club has picked it, which is great. But you write, I think, in the afterword or maybe at the end of the book, that you did some traveling for the book. You traveled around the US a bit, to Canada and Israel. But I love this line where you said, well, I did most of the work lying on my sofa. And I love that because it certainly doesn't feel like a sofa lying kind of book. So you're very productive on your sofa. But what I'm curious about, you're very young. What were you doing when you started this book? Did you have a job? What was your occupation? Were you what were you doing when you started it? And then how did you find an agent and a publisher? And at what point did you see what you had?
Yeah, I did a master's in journalism and I graduated in January 2020. And I had this sort of idea sort of brewing, and I thought, like, maybe I'll just give it 3 months. And then obviously it was March 2020. And, as a new graduate, with the world shutting down, I realized it was unlikely to, get a real job at that point. So I just focused on this for most of the pandemic. And then I kind of had this voice in my head saying, you'll never finish this. This is just going to be some weird little project that sits on your computer for the rest of your life. And maybe you'll say one day, like, oh, I wrote half a book. And I think actually fear is a great driving force. I was so convinced that I would never finish it. And I don't know, I hated the idea of not finishing it so much that sort of compelled me to finish it. And then I think it's, usually with nonfiction, you write a proposal and then you get an agent and the agent sells that to a publisher, and then you have to write the book, you have your contract. But I kind of did the opposite way around, which is more common for novels, which is that I wrote the whole thing. And then I got in touch with maybe 10 agents in the UK. It's quite fun. It's a quite fun process. You sort of stalk them online a bit. They have these bios on their literary agency websites, and you see who you sort of gel with. And then I sent them all whatever they asked for. Usually it's the first chapter or the first 1,000 words, or maybe 3,000 words. And then a few got back to me and said, send me the rest. And then I met some of them for coffee, and then chose one who then sold it to a British publisher and didn't sell it to a US publisher. And it was only a year later that I got a US agent who sold it to a US publisher.
So I had heard in another interview you did that the manuscript originally was quite a bit bigger. It was a lot longer, like twice as long, and you had to chop it. When it was twice as long, was it in the form that it's in now, or was that when it was written as a more conventional type of nonfiction narrative memoir?
I guess people always talk about drafts, and the second draft was this and third draft was this. I mean, for me, it was all a lot blurrier, and I guess it slowly sort of morphed into the thing that it ended up being. So for maybe the first year or two, it was this long, unwieldy, bad, boring thing that didn't really make much sense and had sort of holes in it, and bits that were sort of insanely repetitive. And I was kind of cutting it down almost like you're, like hewing a piece of stone. And And then at a certain point during that process, I realized that it might be possible to cut out my voice entirely. And my voice had really not been adding anything. I had, I'd been reading back over this manuscript and sort of shuddering every time I got to a bit written by me and thinking like, this is the worst part of the book. Why don't we just cut to the chase and go straight to the source? So it was very long and it had my voice in there. And then I think it was probably double the length that it is now. And I slowly began to cut out my own voice and cut it down. And I get, that by the end of the cutting process, it's, quite painful. My dad has this phrase, he makes documentaries and he makes them for the BBC. So they have to be a certain length, an hour or 45 minutes. And he will naturally make something that's 2 hours or, an hour and a half. And he says that the process of cutting, at first it feels like cutting off your fingernails, and then you have to cut off your fingers, and then your hands, and then your arms. So, at first you're sort of trimming the fat, and then it gets to the point where the things that you love are sort of on the cutting room floor. And I think that's when you know that something good is happening, when you're losing even the bits you love. So the bits that remain are only the bits that you really love. So I got very into cutting.
And did you do that cutting process before you had a publisher?
Mostly before, and then my publisher made me do more.
Wow, that's really disciplined. So there's so many questions coming in, and I will say to people, we don't have that much time left, and I have a couple more things that I want to talk to about, but somebody wanted to know, and you can actually find this when it's actually in the book, but you know what, talk about it for a minute, because we've talked a lot about the historic research, but the second 2/3 of the book are really more about your family. And Joe is the character that dominates in the last part. And somebody says, I love Joe. Her voice is so memorable and vivid. And she herself is such a novelistic character. Can you describe the process for conducting the historical research within your family?
Sure. So the book starts as being, sources from, written sources, really. And then halfway through, it flips into an oral history, or maybe a bit more than halfway through. It started with Joe, who is my grandmother's half-brother's daughter. Her father, who's my grandmother's half-brother, was called Emmanuel Jochelmann, and he born in the Russian Empire and arrived in New York, I believe in 1912 when he was 14. I don't quite know why or how he was sort of sent there, but my great grandfather accompanied him on the ship to New York, and then sort of let him settle in, and then went back to the Russian Empire. And Emmanuel Jochelmann became an experimental playwright and quickly changed his name to Mjo Bashe. He made up this weird surname, Bashe, Bassze, and married a Southern belle who was an actress in his theatre company. And they had a child together in 1930. And his wife said, please can I name her Jane? And Mjo said, oh, would you mind if I named her? I think she should be called Mjo Bashe II. And Mjo Bashe II is now in her 90s. And I, as with so many of the things in this book, I didn't know about it. My family didn't know of her existence. My dad vaguely remembered her visiting London in about 1951. He's 10 years younger than her. So I think he was 10 and she was 20. And, she was this sort of strange and glamorous American cousin who wrote with funny handwriting and spoke in a funny accent and delivered all these delicious treats like chocolate and chewing gum, which these post-war children in North London were not used to. And I called Jo, as she's now called, in I guess it was the spring of 2020, and as soon as she picked up, I knew that she had to be sort of a character in this story, because she spoke so beautifully, and she was so funny, and her memories of the 30s and 40s were just razor sharp, sharper than my memories of yesterday. And also, I guess the most useful thing was that, she She's a huge reader. She studied and taught English. And as a result, she speaks in a sort of beautifully, every sentence is like a beautifully formed thing. And as someone who has done a lot of transcribing, generally people speak in quite a sort of ungrammatical, winding way, like I'm doing now. And when you transcribe it, it's these sort of messy sentences, whereas everything she said was just perfect, almost like a sort of soundbite. So this, you know, all these hours and hours of interviews that I did with her, from those transcripts, I sort of crafted this narrative, which was her side of the story, her perspective of growing up in the melting pot of New York, and then eventually her visit to my my sort of direct family in London just after World War II.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I hate to say it, we're getting towards the end and there's a lot more commentary and a lot more questions from people, but we like to end with it. I would not ask this question if you hadn't said when we were talking before the show that you're thinking of your next book. And so if you don't mind giving people just a little, and first, people should read this book if you haven't already. As you can tell, we've only touched on a tiny bit of it, and you'll be so happy that you decided to do that. But tell us if you could just